This webinar is the first in a series about what it takes for districts to be effective in their practice of inclusive instructional and organizational leadership. I'm Deborah Telfer, Director of the University of Cincinnati's Systems Development and Improvement Center, SDI Center for short. The SDI Center provides support to educational and other human services organizations focusing on equity, social justice, and inclusion. The webinar series includes 5 presentations, an overview of 4 leadership practices, and a more detailed webinar about each of the 4 practices. This webinar is the first in a series of 5 that provides background knowledge about inclusive instructional and organizational leadership. This approach to leadership mobilizes a school district and its schools to promote high levels of learning overall, as well as among each subgroup of students. It simultaneously supports effectiveness and equity. In such a school district, all students thrive. They experience a rich set of learning opportunities and stretch to meet high expectations. They learn a lot, and they see the relevance of what they learn. School districts that promote inclusive cultures and practices bring all students into one mutually supportive community. Educators break down traditional general education and special education silos and do away with other forms of segregation. At this point, your group might find it helpful to pause the video briefly and discuss the question on the screen. The question is this: the definition of inclusive instructional and organizational leadership presented in the previous slide draws attention to actions a district might take. What actions do you think would support greater inclusivity in your school district? Why? What do we know in general about inclusive instructional and organizational leadership? From the 1970s forward, a large body of research on school leadership pointed to practices that led to instructional excellence and improved student performance. This research emphasized instructional leadership. Later, another somewhat unrelated body of research began to identify leadership practices that promote equity, social justice, and inclusion. As it turns out, the practices aren't all that different. Much of the research on instructional and inclusive leadership drew attention to what principals do. A focus on what district leaders do is even more recent. The recent research identifies 4 sets of practices that improve district-wide capacity for making education more effective and more equitable. These sets of practices involve promoting system-wide learning, prioritizing the improvement of teaching and learning, building capacity through support and accountability, and sustaining an open and collaborative culture. In this webinar, we will review each set of practices briefly. Then, in the next 4 webinars in the series, we will describe each set of practices in detail, along with ways to put the practices into place in a school district. Educational improvement depends on system-wide learning because observing the effect of every improvement strategy is the only way to determine whether or not the strategy is working. The term data-based decision-making may be overused, but the practices it draws attention to are critical for organizational change and for ongoing organizational effectiveness. The opposite of using data to drive decision-making, and also problem-solving and planning, is to rely on guesswork, shooting from the hip, or throwing up one's hands and leaving everything to chance. System-wide learning is almost synonymous with improvement. If we aren't learning, we're stagnating, and if we're stagnating, we can't possibly be improving. Perhaps stop the video again, this time to think together about the critical role that school districts play in the educational improvement process. The questions on the screen may help you think about the relevant issues. Why is the district the right agency to take point on an initiative to promote educational improvement? What happens when one school in a district tries to take point? What happens when a state education agency tries to take point? As your group discussions may have touched on, districts are close enough to the work and to the community to plan, implement, and support improvement efforts. Schools are too small. They do not have sufficient control to sustain improvement work, and they lack the critical connection to community governance structures such as school boards and advisory councils. State education agencies certainly can mandate, encourage, and support improvement work, but they are too distant from local actors and actions to make improvements stick. State education agencies are regulatory bodies. They take point on external accountability and statutory compliance. That critical role makes it harder for SEAs to cultivate the kind of internal accountability that is needed for sustained educational improvement. The second key practice involves prioritizing teaching and learning. But don't schools and school districts, almost by definition, prioritize teaching and learning? Not always. The next Turn and Talk activity asks you to rate different school district purposes in terms of their direct connection to teaching and learning. A third Turn and Talk activity provides more insight into what it means to prioritize teaching and learning. Here's what to do when you stop the video. Look at the list of education purposes provided on the slide. Discuss the extent to which each of them prioritizes teaching and learning. Perhaps use a 1 to 3 scale to rate each purpose, with 1 indicating a strong connection to teaching and learning, and a 3 indicating a weak connection. In the Turn and Talk activity, you may have differed with others in your group about which educational purposes are closest to the teaching and learning mission. That situation is to be expected because education is a complex social institution with multiple aims. Still, a school district in league with its community and with the wider state and national community must decide what it means by teaching and learning. As a considerable body of research shows, the district must then direct its efforts toward accomplishing that small set of purposes. It may need or want to do some other things, of course, but its major focus must be on what it sees as most important. The third key practice involves building capacity through support and accountability. Richard Elmore, 2002, page 5, refers to this practice as reciprocal accountability, and he defines it in the following way. For every increment of performance I demand from you, I have an equal responsibility to provide you with the capacity to meet that expectation. Likewise, for every investment you make in my skill and knowledge, I have a reciprocal responsibility to demonstrate some new increment in performance. His definition simplifies the concept because it focuses on just one person's capacity. A school district, of course, like any complex organization, combines the capacities of many people, all directed toward a common set of aims. Effective districts support the capacities needed to address those aims well, and they hold personnel accountable for accomplishing those aims. This slide shows how support and accountability practices might be aligned to help a district meet a key objective related to students' reading achievement. If the district wants to see improvements in reading achievement, it needs to support improvements in the teaching of reading. 2 contributors to improved teaching are professional development and high-quality materials. In addition to providing supports, the district should also hold certain expectations. For instance, district leaders might expect teachers to participate actively in the PD and to use the strategies and materials that the district endorses and supplies. The final key practice relates to sustaining an open and collaborative culture. In many districts, changes in structures, changes in organizational culture, and changes in standard procedures will all be needed to put this key practice into place. That's because school districts in many places are top-down rather than collaborative. Their cultures may foster suspicion, fear, and defensiveness, and they may have few mechanisms for bringing educators together to plan, implement, and monitor productive change. Perhaps stop the video one last time to discuss what's in a culture. Think about organizational culture and brainstorm a list of everything it might involve. Then consider the features that distinguish a closed culture from an open one. As your discussion may have surfaced, open cultures encourage trust, risk-taking, dialogue, collegiality, diversity of perspectives, willingness to agree to disagree, and willingness to pay attention to new ideas and information. In contrast, closed cultures are risk-aversive and threatening. Individuals protect their own turf, and there's little incentive to accept diverse perspectives or consider innovative ideas. This webinar has provided a brief overview of 4 inclusive instructional and organizational leadership practices. We will explore each of these key practices in depth in the 4 subsequent webinars. For now, we want to pose several focusing questions to help you start thinking about what inclusive leadership really means. Why should districts use key practices associated with inclusive instructional and organizational leadership? How does this approach to leadership support inclusive attitudes and actions? How do inclusive attitudes and actions help districts foster equity? What do inclusive and equitable schools have to offer all students?